Welcome. Welcome everyone to day 40 of the 75 Days of Partition Live podcast series that the 1947 Partition Archive has been doing to mark this landmark year. I'm Sonam Kalra. I'm a musician with my own body of work in music, delving into the partition, and I'm here today on behalf of the 1947 Partition Archive to welcome our very, very special guest, Andrew Whitehead. Andrew Whitehead, a name I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with, has over the past 25 years recorded more than 200 interviews with people who lived through the very turbulent time and the trauma of partition. These recordings are now held in the archive of SOAS, the School of Oriental and African Studies at the University of London. Dr. Whitehead drew on this material for his book, A Mission in Kashmir 2007, which used oral history and archive material to look afresh at the inception of the Kashmir conflict in 1947-1948. More recently, he has written The Lives of Frida in 2019, a biography of an English woman, Frida Bedi, who made her life in India and was an active figure in the nationalist movements in Lahore and in Kashmir in the 1930s and 40s. This again was based in part on oral history. Andrew is a former BBC India correspondent and he is an honorary professor at the University of Nottingham in the UK. He also teaches at the Asian College of Journalism in Chennai. Professor Whitehead, it's truly such a pleasure to have you here with us today. As I said to you just a few minutes ago, I've heard of you for years and I've really, always wanted to have the chance to speak to you, and I must thank the Partition Archive for allowing me this opportunity to speak to someone like you and literally pick your brain. So I'm going to jump straight.
I'm really honoured to be part of this conversation, looking forward very much to it, and very pleased to be able to support the work of the 1947 Partition Archive, which is so valuable and so urgent as well.
Right. And I mean, how did you get interested in partition? You're from Britain and you're interested in Indian partition. That in itself, I think, to many people is surprising, because you've also written a book on it. And you've written a book from a very interesting perspective, from the Kashmir side of it, A Mission in Kashmir. So how did you get interested in partition is my first question, which I'm leading into my second. And what was your inspiration to write a book specifically from the Kashmir angle?
Well, how did I get interested in partition? I spent 4 years in the mid-1990s as the BBC India correspondent based in Delhi. I'd been a historian before I came to India. I'd done work on a PhD. I'd done a bit of oral history, not a great deal, but I had done some oral history. And when I was working as a correspondent in Delhi, and in the run-up particularly to the 50th anniversary of independence for India and Pakistan and partition, there was a lot of reflection about partition. I read partition novels, I read Khushwant Singh's Train to Pakistan, I read Bisham Sani's Tamas, I read Babsi Sidhwa's Ice Candy Man, and I managed to persuade my bosses at the BBC to let me make 5 half-hour radio documentaries, not about the high partition of 1947, but about the lived experience of partition. And I had the great privilege of being able to travel for about 4 months across South Asia, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, talking to people with memories of 1947, people who'd been refugees, people who'd suffered violence, and on occasions people who had perpetrated violence, cultural figures who'd written about partition, military people who had been involved in uniform in partition. So that's where my interest in partition really stemmed from.
But that's quite an incredible landscape of people to have covered, as you said, from military people, from writers, from poets, historians. You just mentioned that you had the chance to, in your meetings with all these people, you spoke to Khushwant Singh, you spoke to Babsi Sidhwa, who wrote Ice Candy Man, and I know that you even spoke to Amrita Pritham, which to me is it's just incredible that you had the opportunity to speak to these people who were able to voice their feelings of partition so eloquently and so beautifully. What was it like for you when you met Amrita Pritham? Because her poetry on here, on Tuvarish Shah, that plea that she writes as a letter, it's so moving. And so, what was it like? What did she say about that?
I remember the interview very acutely. It was the spring of 1997, and she was living in South Delhi, and I'd arranged to come round, and I went round, and she was then in her late 70s, petite, a little frail, but really indomitable of spirit, and she didn't really have any small talk. She just wanted to get the interview done. So we started, and I asked her about how she came to write an ode to Tuvarish Shah. And she talked about being a refugee herself in 1947 and travelling by train across east to west, west to east, I beg your pardon, and being overcome by her reflections on what the suffering of women in Punjab, and taking out a piece of paper in her pocket and jotting down what became an ode to Tuvarish Shah. But what really unsettled me is she very quickly started weeping as she was recalling this, and she was still talking. She was very clear in her memories, but she was really quite overcome, and she went on to reflect about what is it about men that they treat women so? Don't they realize that they're disgracing themselves more than the people that they're dishonoring? And the strength with which she spoke, the eloquence with which she spoke, stays with me now.
So 50 years later, she was still as moved. And, we've been talking about this and how we talked last evening of PTSD, of the scars of partition, and how they're not just the people who went through it, but they're transgenerational. And, how we don't talk about it enough, and which is why I'm so glad we're getting a chance we are going to be talking about it for 75 days and all of the great work that the Partition Archive does to revive these conversations and these oral histories. And speaking of oral histories, you have done such a great job with collecting so many oral histories. And as we were just discussing before we went live, the oral history is perhaps the more valuable history, more valuable than the history and the narratives of history books, which is devoid of emotion. But you collected oral histories mostly in Kashmir, if I'm right. Can you share with us why you did the Kashmir oral history? I
recorded oral histories. Yeah.
Please.
So I recorded oral histories across South Asia. So Kashmir was just a part of that. But I went on to write a book about Kashmir largely because I'd got to know Kashmir well as a journalist. Kashmir was in it was very deeply unsettled and troubled place in the 1990s. So I was always going there as a news journalist because there was always tension and violence there. But when I travelled around Kashmir gathering testimony of what happened in 1947 and went to Srinagar and went to Baramulla, talked to military people who'd been there, even people in Azad Kashmir, in Pakistan Kashmir as well. It struck me that the stories that they were telling, very cathartic stories of Kashmir in late 1947, when there was an invasion of the Kashmir Valley, the nuances of their recollections slightly challenged the established narratives. There are three narratives of what happened in Kashmir. There's the Indian narrative, there's the Pakistani narrative, and there's the Kashmiri nationalist narrative. And all of them are somewhat oversimple. And getting oral history, getting personal testimony, both adds something of the complexity of what was happening at the time, but it also injects people back into the story. This is not a story about a patch of land. It's about people, their lives, their hopes, their aspirations, their families, and that's what oral history does. It personalizes history. So it's not just about nations and governments and statesmen. It's about people.
That's absolutely true. And what was some of when you say the narrative was different from these three narratives, how was it different? What was the one sort of underlying motive or story that emerged?
There was not one underlying motif, but I remember I went to Baramulla, which is, so to speak, on the sharp end of the Kashmir Valley, closer to the line of control, and spoke. I met, just by chance, I went to a convent and mission hospital, which I knew had been attacked in 1947. And there was still an Italian nun who'd been there since 1933, who had lived through the attack and shared her memories. And she spoke about who the attackers were, what they did, what language they spoke, what uniform they were, how they were commanded, how they travelled, all of which slightly challenged the established narratives. And I spoke to people in the town who, one guy, I remember, he was quite a prosperous guy. And he said he hitched a ride into town with the invaders, who were pro-Pakistan, but they weren't the Pakistan army. They were an informal armed force. And he was clearly sympathetic to the invaders, sympathetic to Pakistan's cause. But he said, after a couple of days, these guys looted him too. They were interested in loot. They were looking out for women. There was a real sense of terror as they occupied the town. And it's just one of those elements of complexity which you can sometimes lose sight of. Kashmir in 1947 was a very complex narrative. I mean, if Kashmir had had a simple cause, it might have a simple solution, but it didn't have a simple cause, and that's why it hasn't had an easy solution, I'm afraid.
Or resolution of any kind. But were there more such interesting stories from your oral history collection which break these myths about the Kashmir situation during partition that you can recall?
Well, I certainly talked to people. I talked to Indian soldiers who served there in 1947-48, who discovered that on the Pakistan side of a particular valley, there were people that they had been to training college with before independence, and how they would swap cigarettes across the front line. And they would still fight each other, and they were still determined to win, but there was that sense of allegiance. And I think the stories that struck me most was not so much about the conflict, but actually what was happening in Kashmir in 47, as well as an invasion by pro-Pakistan tribesmen, which the Indian army repulsed, or largely repulsed. There was also a popular movement within Srinagar in the Kashmir Valley when the Maharaja left the Kashmir Valley and Sheikh Abdullah became the dominant political force. And this was a moment of political empowerment. Many of the young in Srinagar felt that the old order had been banished and there was a new start, a new progressive era. And I spoke to quite a few women who'd enrolled in a women's militia set up by Sheikh Abdullah, trained by the Indian army. But the sight of women, both Pandit and Muslim women in Srinagar, training, drilling, using rifles, being inspected on one occasion by Jawaharlal Nehru in the spring of 1948, was a real indication of the scale of social as well as political change which came about in what had been a very conservative princely state.
Right. But how was it for you when you conducted the oral histories in such a contested area? I mean, as you said, it was a very difficult time in Kashmir. Were people willing to tell these stories, to share with you?
It was. And yes, I don't think everybody was, but certainly public figures were. So I spoke to people like Karan Singh, who was then the Crown Prince, Farooq Abdullah, Sheikh Abdullah's then very young son, Abdul Ghani Lone, who became a very prominent Kashmiri separatist. So I spoke to all them, and ordinary Kashmiris, of course, as well. And I think initially people are unwilling to share a narrative which goes against their current political and community loyalty and allegiance. But as you have a longer conversation, you delve back into more precise memories. I think you get beyond that carapace, that broad brushstroke, to the finer brushstrokes. And that's when you get the really valuable memory, sentiment, reflection, and detail, which, as I say, humanizes and personalizes what happened to so many people in 1947 in Kashmir and much more widely.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, so your book on Kashmir, when you collected these oral histories, was there anything specific? Again, I come back to women to understand what happened to the women, because we talk so much about what happened to the women in Punjab, but how was it for the women in Kashmir? Was it much the same? Was it different? And also, I want to touch upon what happened to the Hindus and Muslims in Kashmir, because it's still something that continues. The whole sense of being wronged is something that 75 years later we haven't got past.
One of the things that really, so the level of violence against women, of rape and abduction, was not as great and profound in the Kashmir Valley as it was
Oh,
in
really?
Punjab, or indeed even in Jammu, another part of the princely state. But there was rape and abduction, and the Lashkar that came in, the tribesmen, they were certainly, I think there's no doubt about it, they were seeking out non-Muslim women. And I met a family of a Sikh family who were living in Baramulla in 1997, and I remember speaking via a Punjabi interpreter to a Sikh woman who remembered 3 cousins who had been abducted from the Baramulla region in the autumn of 1947, and she still didn't know what had happened to them. She didn't know whether they'd been abducted and were living a different life in a different area, whether they had been killed and their bodies disposed of. But when I did a little bit more digging, first of all, I found that the 3 cousins she was talking about were listed in the Indian government record. There is an Indian government printed volume of all the women that were abducted, known to be abducted at partition. They were listed there, and they were almost exactly the same age at that time of this woman. So it wasn't simply cousins that she was talking about. She was talking about cousins who were exactly in her position geographically and in age terms. So that must be quite something. We talk about PTSD, but it must be quite something to live with. And the Sikhs in particular in Baramulla and other parts of the Kashmir Valley were forced to flee as the invading force came in October and November 1947, and they had a very difficult time. All communities suffered, but at that particular time and in that particular place, the suffering of the Sikh community was particularly immense.
Yes, there are. I think there's some beautiful BBC recordings of a gentleman called Bir Bahadur who talks of how the entire village of women, when they believed that there were people coming, and they were beheaded, which was the irony of it all. They were beheaded to be saved. Just the
Now,
very thought
I
of
met Bir Bahadur Singh and spoke to him. Yeah, and I also spoke to his mother. And his mother, so this was in a village called Tor Khalsa, near Kahutar in West Punjab, where the Sikhs were the more prosperous community, and there was a real fear that the Sikh women in particular would fall into the hands of a mob which was approaching on the village. And certainly Bir Bahadur Singh recalls that some young female members of his extended family were beheaded by older
father.
Sikhs to stop them being dishonoured. And his mother told an even more remarkable story, that actually a lot of women there jumped down a well to
Save themselves.
commit suicide. And there's no there's no doubt. I mean, I spoke to Bisham Sani, the novelist, who was present when some of the bodies were retrieved from that very same well, and it features in his novel Tamas. But Bir Bahadur's mother actually jumped into the well, but the well by then was, it sounds grotesque to say, but it was so full of bodies that she didn't fall very far, and she wasn't really greatly injured, and she was retrieved. And of course, she survived. And I met her in Bogle, in South Delhi. This would be again in 1997. And I went to a service of commemoration for the dead of Tor Khalsa in the Gurudwara in Bogal, which Bir Bahadur took me to. So, and of course you become, and you hear all these stories, and it's very difficult as an interviewer to know quite how to respond, because these stories are so profound and so terrible and so wounding. But I'm have to say what I tended to do, because I suppose it's what my journalism trained me to do, as well as being an oral historian, was if people were willing to continue talking, I would continue to ask the questions. And if people indicated that they didn't wish to go any further, or they didn't wish to continue the conversation, of course you would respect that. But most people, they wanted what happened to them and their families to be known and to be acknowledged. They wanted to give a voice to what they saw as a profound wrong. I'm sure not everybody saw it that way, but the people who, inevitably the people who you come across who are willing to share their memories tended to want to have those memories heard, respected and validated. I mean, I remember I went with a journalist colleague, just by chance. We knew there was an ashram in Jalandhar, which was set up at the time, in the aftermath of partition, for women who were retrieved or were by themselves or whatever. And we found the Gandhi Vanita ashram in Jalandhar, and there were still, in 1997, there were still 3 women there who'd been in that or in other ashrams permanently since 1947. And they were very keen to tell their stories. They hadn't told their stories to outsiders, to people outside their immediate community. And I remember we weren't staying in Jalandhar that night. We were going on to Amritsar, and it was starting to get dark, and this woman was telling a story, but it was quite a long story, and I suppose I was probably getting a bit fidgety. And this woman turned at me and said, "You can just stay sitting there. I've waited 50 years to tell this story. You can stay and listen." So I stayed and listened.
But how special is that? I think even for you to have had, as you said, the honor of being the person who gets to carry this narrative, this piece of history, this huge piece of history forward. What you said about, I mean, Andrew, my very, very own great-grandmother told me the very same story of the well being filled in their village. So this was obviously something that was happening across the Punjab. But so much of what you've said sort of just sparks thoughts in me. When you said that you've spoken to people in the military, I wonder what was it like for them. When you belong to one army, the army also gets split. As you said, people you've shared cigarettes, and then you have to kill each other. What about the PTSD of that? What about the stories that perhaps some of those people shared with you? Was there ever something you could remember, maybe?
Yeah, I was just reflecting the day. I spoke to a brigadier, a Sikh brigadier who was with the Indian Army, and part of what he was asked to do in the immediate aftermath of partition was to try and support the activities to retrieve abducted women. So once the immediate trauma was over, both India and Pakistan went to quite a lot of trouble to try and locate and retrieve abducted women who were on in essence, the wrong side of the new partition line drawn up through Punjab. And he was in charge of helping to organise that, helping to resource that. I also spoke to another woman, Sheila Sengupta, who was part of a retrieval team, actually working in Delhi, trying to find abducted Muslim women and being able to return them to Pakistan. I say return to Pakistan. In many cases, these women had never been in Pakistan, what became Pakistan. And as she said, I mean, one of the more remarkable aspects of this retrieval policy was the women had no agency. So this policy activity continued for about 7 or 8 years, to the mid-50s. If an abducted woman was located and found, and it was quite clear she had been abducted, she had no say in whether she stayed or went. She had to be sent to the place which, in a sense, claimed her. So in some circumstances, obviously, women had been married to their abductors. They may in some way have made peace with that situation. Quite often they may have borne children, but if they were identified as an abducted woman, they had to be returned, if returned is the right word, but sent to the country which, as I say, which claimed them in terms of their communal religious identity. So sometimes, at least, a second grave wrong was done by not allowing women the agency to decide what should happen to them, whether they should stay or go.
Yesterday, we had Professor Sanjeev with us, who said that they were not allowed agency to the extent of, if they were pregnant, they had to abort the babies, which were supposedly the wrong babies as well. I mean, that is just heartbreaking to think of. As you said, I mean, how much more grave wrongs could have been committed against them. So the other thing I want to ask you about...
Sorry, yeah, it's terrible.
Please.
No,
please go ahead. Please. There's a bit of a lag, which is why sometimes I'm unable to. But no, please go ahead, and then I will ask you one more question.
I was just saying, one of the interviews that I did in 1997, and I was aware when I was doing the interviews that these were quite remarkable, and I let them run long, and I kept all the tapes, all the audio tapes, which is what is now in the archive at SOAS. There was the mother of a friend, an elderly Parsi woman, lived in Connaught Place, and my friend said, my mother was a medical relief worker in 1947. She'll have some memories. So I went to interview her mother at her home in CP. And she had this amazing story of being, as a very young woman herself, I think I'm right in saying not at that time married, she spent a large part of the summer of 1947 with another group of volunteers based at Lady Hardinge Hospital, who would go into Old Delhi railway station and they would meet the refugee trains coming in. And their job was to get to the unaccompanied women fast, because there were lots of unaccompanied women in different states of trauma. And she said the big task was to get to them before the brothel keepers, because some people were trying to trick these women into going to stay somewhere safe, but were actually looking for women to be almost kept captive in brothels, and the welfare workers had to try and beat them to it. Then they had to try and get medical help. They then had to get all the details from the women, and in due course they had to try and reunite them with their families, which she said was quite a difficult task, because sometimes one thing she said that really stayed in my mind, she said, an educated man would come and he would say, "I'm sorry, I am not having her back." And an uneducated man would come, she said, and he would say, "It's not her fault, I'll have her back." And she was still angry that it tended to be the more educated men that would not accept their wives back in these post-partition circumstances. But I also remember my friend kept walking into the room when I was doing the interview, and it was slightly causing a little bit of an interruption, and I sort of said to her afterwards, "So why did you keep walking into the room?" And she said, "I'd never heard the stories myself. I knew my mother was a medical relief worker, but I'd never heard her say exactly what she did. I'd never heard her say what life was like for the women in the camps that were set up in Delhi. It was something that she acknowledged but didn't really dwell on." So it was, again, you say privilege. It really is a privilege to hear these stories and to find ways of, first of all, unlocking the stories, because you've got to develop a certain relationship of trust.
Right.
And then of finding ways of respecting them. And there were occasions when you met perpetrators. I only met one or two perpetrators who were unrepentant, but you did meet perpetrators of violence on occasions. And I have to say, that is also part of the story, and you actually want to have an understanding of what motivated them as well, difficult as that is to sit through, but nevertheless, you want to get as wide a range of voices as you possibly can.
What was it like to meet the perpetrators? When you say they were unrepentant, they would relate these stories to you, saying they were completely justified?
Yeah, nobody admitted to any act of sexual violence, but I did meet a Sikh small farmer outside Amritsar who was part of a gang which harassed and killed Muslim kafilas, caravans of refugees, as they were heading from east to west. And he basically said, they did it to us, we did it to them, they deserved it. And you would get similar sentiments, not quite so clearly expressed by others. But you also had some people who, as they told the story of the violence that they had witnessed, you really wondered. There was one guy in particular, he told this story. I mean, he was quite excited as he was telling it, of watching a partition riot and watching people being killed. And then he pointed up on his wall, and there was a mounted sword on the wall. And he said, that is from that time. He said, I never used it. But then the whole tenor of the story was that he kept that because it spoke to him about something from that time, which gave him some form of, I don't know, vindication or status, I don't know. So everybody has to develop a narrative that they can live with.
Of course.
And I think some people developed a narrative which, in some level, justified their actions. Sorry.
No, in Kashmir, was it much the same sort of? I know you said that it wasn't as bad for the women in Kashmir as it was in Punjab, but in general, the narrative in Kashmir, was there a sort of unified narrative? Or I've asked you this in a different way, but I was just trying to understand what was really the underlying emotion in Kashmir, because it seems to be so different from the Punjab.
It was different, and I think you didn't get the same sort of partition riots. You didn't get the mob riots that you got in much of Punjab, and indeed in Jammu. So what you did get was the invading force of Pakistani tribesmen in October, November 1947, which was acting informally on behalf of the new nation of Pakistan. And you got people telling stories about seeing some of these armed tribal fighters, this Lashkar as they were called,
Right.
And how they responded to that. But there was very little in the way of communal violence between Kashmiris in 1947. So you didn't get Kashmiri Muslims attacking non-Muslims, and you didn't get Kashmiri Pandits and Sikhs attacking Kashmiri Muslims. Broadly, that didn't happen. So it was very different from Punjab in that respect. But of course, the way that the whole Kashmir crisis unfolded, what happened in the summer and autumn of 1947 led to a geopolitical crisis and fault line, which remains with us still. And you know, I have been to Kashmir quite a lot, and it still absolutely bedevils the lives of the people of the Kashmir Valley, and it still means that the two partition twins, India and Pakistan, continue to have very, very strained relations, and Kashmir is the primary, it's not the only, but it's the primary cause of that.
And I'm going to ask you one last question. I know we're over time, but it's just been so interesting speaking to you that I wish the time would not be ending. But I wanted to ask you, so do you really think that more and more we should be focusing, even in schools perhaps, or in all the conversations we have, on oral histories versus the cold writings of textbooks?
Well, there's a number of things. First of all, the window for conducting oral history is, alas, circumscribed. So I very much hope the archive will persist, will be available to scholars in future generations. If we don't record the oral history now or very soon, it will be lost. So I think that gives an urgency to oral history. But again, I still think that by and large, 1947 is still seen in geopolitical terms rather than in terms of what happened to people. And it was novels and then film which first caught the lived experience of partition. Mm-hmm. But actually understanding people's stories and what people went through, the suffering they went through, and there's a sort of a rather uneasy sort of there's almost matching stories. You know, what happened to one side in one place was matched by what happened to the other community in another place. And I think, again, that's lost sight of as people tend to reflect inevitably on what happened to them and their families and their communities. But there is another side to be told. And I think oral history can help to provide that breadth of perspective, which isn't always easily available.
Thank you so much, Professor Whitehead. It's really been absolutely fascinating speaking to you. Thank you for sharing some of the stories that you had, as I said, the privilege, the honor of being able to help people with. We hope to see you again. For those of you who just joined us, this was, of course, a mini podcast that we've been doing for 75 Days of Partition. Please join us tomorrow for day 41 of 75 Days of Partition. It's a daily micro podcast series being aired for 75 days between June 3rd, 2022 and August 17th, 2022, except on Sundays. To mark the 75th anniversary of partition in 2022, the series entails live conversation bursts with historians, filmmakers, authors, art makers, and other practitioners working on uncovering and understanding the history of partition. The goal is to introduce new findings to you, to broaden your perspectives, to understand partition better, to spark your curiosity, and perhaps bend your mind and change your mind through short daily micro discussions. We'll see you tomorrow. Thank you so much for joining in. Once again, thank you, Professor Whitehead. Good night.